back, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Paideia today. I am joined here, as always, by my colleague, Dr. Scott Masson. I am Dr. Bill Friesen, and today we are talking about an extraordinary and extraordinarily interesting individual in the figure of John Donne, a poet, a preacher, a writer, more broadly speaking. And John Donne is living in an enormously interesting time. He's living just in the wake of what people oftentimes describe as the age of merry old England, the golden age, the time of Shakespeare, the time of Ben Jonson, the time of Edmund Spenser, and all these other giants. But here we're in now a uniquely different age. It still bears many of the resemblances that it has inherited from the earlier part of the Renaissance. But John Donne is tracking into a new era, and he stands in a position very much as a bridge, a literary bridge, an intellectual bridge, a man who lives between worlds, what you might call, if you want to use the more sophisticated language, an interstitial man, a man between places. And his life reflects this biographically as much as it does in his formal and published works. And usually, I don't like dwelling too long on the biography of an individual, but here it's very difficult to disentangle the personal biography of John Donne from his output and his influence on the culture and the art of England at this period in history. One of the first things we should note is that John Donne was born a Catholic and died an Anglican. And this sets up one of the great schisms in John Donne's life, because John Donne, as far as we can tell from the evidence, was not merely a Catholic. He was a very devout Catholic, and he moved in circles of other devout Catholic thinkers in his day. But the difficulty was that in this period in English history, it was not convenient at all to one's career, to one's respectability, to be a Catholic. And so this immediately is one of the things that sets John apart from many of his contemporaries. He was urged on numerous occasions to convert to Anglicanism, if not Protestantism. And one of the marks of, in my personal view, the man's integrity was that time and again, he would not convert. He just could not convert. It would have been the convenient thing to do in any number of, or for any number of reasons. And yet he didn't do it. The pressure upon him financially as well as socially and as well as an artist was enormous, and yet the man delayed and delayed and delayed. He had a large family to support and lived in considerable poverty. There is plenty of evidence that at certain points in his career he contemplated suicide, but his religious views forbade him and held him back from that. So this is a man, for all his exuberance in many of his poems, was nevertheless a man oftentimes haunted by what we would now anachronistically describe as severe depression. In addition to this was the fact that John Donne had started his career, as is the case with many of the figures that we have looked at and will look at here in the future, as a writer and a thinker of tremendous promise. People expected great things from John Donne. This is a man of very formidable intellectual capacity. He is enormously well-read, and unfortunately, we're only going to have a chance to talk very briefly about some of the intellectual framework and training and eloquence of this towering figure of his age. Nevertheless, he was connected with powerful people. He also engaged, some people are surprised to find this, he actually engaged in two swashbuckling maritime expeditions, one to Spain and another one to the Azores. So John Donne, literally swinging from the rigging, brandishing a rapier, is an actual thing. And it doesn't get played up very much in a lot of circles. So when you're reading the wild, energetic poetry or the deep, contemplative poetry of John Donne, you have to remember that there is this personal history in the background. As if that weren't complicated enough, there are other dichotomies to John Donne. As I've just mentioned, many of his poems are extremely shocking and energetic. They kick in the door, as it were. They swing from the chandeliers. They say unsayable things. And so this figure of John Donne is oftentimes known amongst writers as John Donne the Rake, John Donne the Rogue, John Donne the Swashbuckler. And certainly that individual, that personality exists. But then you have this other side of him, which is not just intellectual, but deeply, deeply, I was going to say theological. That's not the right word. Religious. This is a deeply, deeply religious man, right down to his bones. In point of fact, he became one of the most famous preachers England has ever turned out, and has turned out quite a number. But John Donne is very high up in that list of powerful, influential preachers. Dr. Masson, do you want to say a little bit more about any of these aspects of John Donne?
Well, in relation to his prowess as a preacher, he was the Dean of St. Paul's, which is the most, arguably the most significant pulpit in England. Certainly its proximity to Parliament and the English establishment makes it a place of prominence. And so being installed there as the Dean of St. Paul's marks his prominence, but his sermons were appreciated not just as performances of his verbal prowess, but then written down and preserved in the form in which they're written. I mean, some of them have been preserved in literary forms as elegies, and those features of the English language, like ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. That we get that from Donne. Um, and there are numerous turns of phrase, and of course that becomes then the subject matter of novels thereafter and so forth. So Donne is a towering figure who went through seasons of, I would say, disregard and even contempt in the English literary tradition, and has reestablished himself to some degree in the 20th century, probably goes back into the 19th, but to my mind is the great poet of his era. And I don't think enough is heard of him. I personally see him as representing not only a great poet, but as a figure that holds together the discordant ideas of the age as well. So
Yeah.
I use him for didactic purposes to illustrate various intellectual, religious, social concerns, and to be the sort of conduit for those. So he is the figure of his era. That's how I see him.
Yeah, there are accounts surviving of him preaching at St. Paul's, and then them opening up every door and aperture that they possibly can, because St. Paul's, when he was preaching, would be filled to quite literally over capacity, and a great crowd of people would be listening attentively outside to try to hear what he was saying inside in St. Paul's itself. This was the scale of his popularity in his own day. And what a lot of people also don't know is that it was a standard English tradition at this time to go to these sermons and for very, not sensational, very debatable topics and things of this sort to be brought up and to be hashed over and to be considered in considerable depth. And then you would go off to your dinner and you would debate with your friends the various subject matter that had been brought up during a sermon. And Donne was actually extremely popular on this front as well.
Yeah.
What I haven't mentioned so far is his fall from grace. Obviously, his Roman Catholic faith was a catalyst in his fall, but also was the marriage garnered without permission from his patron. He married his patron's young daughter, and this was the thing which caused him to be first and foremost cast into the utter darkness of poverty and disregard and things like this. So this, combined with his Roman Catholic faith, meant that the middle of his life represented something of a nadir that he had to struggle through. And what I sometimes tell my students is that if you read enough actual biographies, if somebody is up high in terms of their artistic status, social status, economic status, and all these sorts of things, and if they undergo such a great fall as John Donne underwent, 99% of the time plus, they don't come back. And
No.
what is extraordinary about John Donne is he ends his career, he ends his life on a high note. But as you've noted quite rightly, his literary reputation after his era has been something which has fluctuated considerably. He is savaged by a number of prominent literary critics, in the Restoration and then moving into the 18th century, most notably John Dryden and Samuel Johnson. Johnson in particular derided the style of poetry that John Donne was writing, metaphysical poetry, in
Mm,
contrast to cavalier poetry,
yes.
as the violent yoking together of discordant sort of ideas. And there's no doubt that John Donne does do that. Then the question becomes, is that necessarily a good thing as this manifests, as this reifies in John Donne's poetry, or is it a bad thing? And if you know anything about 18th century literary sensibilities, you can already guess at how they're going to answer. This is an extremely bad thing. This defies all the standard rules of harmonics and unity and all this kind of stuff that they admire in the 18th century.
Yeah.
However, as you say, John Donne ends up making a second literary comeback in history, beginning middle to late Victorian period. You noted earlier before we began recording that Samuel Taylor Coleridge was enamored of his work. Other great writers have been enamored of his work in the 20th century, most notably T.S. Eliot.
T.S. Eliot. Yep.
And the debate rages on
Yep.
currently.
Yep.
A great? Is he not a great? You think he is a great? I'm
I
inclined
do.
to agree with you. I'm
And
inclined.
I'm very strong in my conviction on that. I think he's a great, great writer.
Yes.
But I understand the classical objection to him. It's primarily stylistic, and the reason that that falls on deaf ears in our age is because people have no appreciation of style. So the objection that we don't like his style, just like, so what?
Yes.
And the tendency, which we could indulge too much, and I probably will do so here in discussing this as well, is to suggest Donne's poetry as a conduit for interesting ideas. And really, I do think that that is particularly fascinating. But Donne is no mere yoker of ideas. He is actually a terrific uh, poet. He is a craftsman. And yes, he does yoke heterogeneous ideas. There's no doubt about that. But in doing that, he represents his age. And I think that the Renaissance does try to hold worlds together. Remember, we're in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, the early 16th century. You haven't mentioned, we mentioned it off air, 1588, the Spanish Armada, the political threat that is so prominent that at one point it appears it's going to crush Elizabeth's England, is now gone away. But nonetheless, the religious controversies and the threat of a Catholic Europe over and against England is there. Likewise, there's the new philosophy of Descartes come the 17th century, and similarly, the beginnings of modern science with first with Francis Bacon, and then also with Galileo and his discovery of the cosmology that had been reigned over Christendom for 1500 years was most certainly false. All of these things are enormously important if, as the Renaissance mind and the medieval mind had thought, there is a unity underlying not only the theological view, but the view of the natural world. There's a unity, and it's breaking apart in this period. And Donne is on the threshold of the new era, and yet he's a man of the old knowledge, and he holds them both together. And it's a vital era, and I think it rewards much study.
Yeah, 1588, as you say, was a pivotal year. It was the Great Defeat. One of the features of English culture, and this was noted by an Italian traveler who came to England, was that he noted immediately, A, the English are enormously hardworking. One of the things he said in letters back to Italy was that your average Englishman does more before noon than most Italians do all day. But the second thing that he noted was that they are wildly nationalistic. He said it's bizarre how proud they are of being English. And the highest compliment that they can possibly pay you is to sigh and look at you and say, alas, I wish you were English. And so you get some sense of the scale of unity, social unity that is in England prior to 1588. We call this the age of merry old England for a good reason. It was an age which was at a high point economically, socially, artistically. It was a great, great golden literary age for England.
Yep.
Uh, but after 1588, that external threat, which tended to pull them together in a sense of us versus them, vanishes, and fault lines begin to form at numerous levels. You mentioned the cosmological level here. Yes, absolutely. Again, as with modern discussions of poetic style, nobody talks about cosmology anymore and worldview and things like this in any sort of coherent sense. But this is a very big deal. This is the new age of skepticism. This is an age of widening boundaries that you and I spoke about previously between aristocratic art and indeed aristocratic life, and on the other hand, middle class life or lower class life and things like this. The fault lines, the cracks are forming, and they will break entirely with the most catastrophic war England has ever endured, which is, of course, the English Civil War. Um, but Scott, did we want to get into the poetry itself?
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, but these are, and just to expand on what you're saying before we do that, ever so briefly. As you say, there's a unity there before the Armada that there is not thereafter. So Donne's Anglicanism is not going to prove satisfactory to the those who are more Puritan minded in his age. He is a, despite your depiction of him as a man of integrity, they would see him as a man of compromise and of impurity in his life and in his religion. And so that tension, which was always there in England, is now going to manifest itself. And it will, I only say this because not long after this, few decades later, we're going to see the end of the monarchy as such and a republican government. The English Civil War is going to come about and so forth. And the undercurrent of that we can see already present in Donne's work. It's being held together, but it will break out. And that's all I wanted to say there. I think it's interesting.
Good.
But yes, let's look at his poems. And we talked about this. And Bill, when I teach undergraduates on this, I actually do 2 classes because I see Donne as so important for understanding the different ideas in the era. But we're going to dedicate ourselves to one. So I thought maybe the best way forward would be to do a sonnet sequence, because we've already looked at the sonnet as a form. And we know the associations of it, its origins and Francesco Petrarch and courtly love poetry, the conventions that have arisen with that. We dealt with them there. We also mentioned Shakespeare's use of them. Shakespeare, as you say, a contemporary of Donne's, although a little bit older. The end of Shakespeare's career is the ascendance of Donne's, basically.
Correct.
So Donne would have watched Shakespeare's plays, no doubt, and appreciated that. And you can see dramatic qualities in Donne's poetry. But what it adds in addition to this is the religious sensibilities. Now, many of Donne's poems are not religious per se. In fact, they're shockingly sexual, as it were. And even in his, we're going to see in his religious lyrics here, there are sexual overtones which are shocking to contemporary sensibilities, particularly religious sensibilities, and they were no less shocking in Donne's day.
Yes.
And that, I think that's important. Did you want to say something there before I?
Yeah, a little bit. One of the tendencies of which I try to disabuse my students is the tendency to see the rakish poems as poems of his early/middle career. This is a young man with young man sentiments and kind of a boisterous libido, which is being expressed in certain literary forms. And then as he gets older, he becomes an ever more sober, ever more
Yeah,
individual.
yeah,
There's no actual evidence for that.
none.
Of the poems is all over the shop on both schools of of John Donne's poems, the roguish ones and the pious ones.
Yep,
And so the man is not easy to peg. No,
not at all. And to add to that, the man who taught me 17th century poetry a long time ago now, E.J. Devereux, he said that he thought, and I'm not sure if he was entirely serious in this, but he said when Donne was sounded like he was speaking of sex, he was speaking about religion, and when he sounded like he was speaking of religion, he was speaking of a sex. And I say I was never quite sure whether he was being serious with that, but I took his point. There is an interesting marriage, if as it were, of these two things in his poetry, and a focus on those themes in scripture where God is presented as a husband and the church as his bride, or variously, God is presented as a husband and the bride is presented as unfaithful and therefore a whore. Those are there in his poetry over and over on a personal level and on a broader metaphysical level. So
The popularity of Donne also fluctuates a little bit depending on any given generation's fascination with shock culture.
yeah,
And absolutely, John Donne can shock if he's given some scope for operation and the reader is patient and thoughtful about what he or she is looking at on the page in front of them. But having said that, it could be argued that we're living in an age rather after shock, maybe not after outrage, but certainly after shock. And so is the appeal of John Donne going to fade in such periods, or is it going to carry on? Only posterity will be able to tell us this.
yeah, I agree. So the sonnet sequence, I'll say just a brief bit about it. We know what a sonnet is and the purpose of a sonnet. It's a little lyric poem, 14 lines in length, and conventionally associated with courtly love traditions. We saw what Shakespeare did with that. Donne devotes these this sonnet sequence to a theme, and the theme is of sickness and death. And in that, he is, I think, one of the most profound writers in the English tradition on the religious significance and personal acquaintance with the possibility of death. And you have to realize in this age that for a grown man to fall sick was to open the possibility that he might actually die soon. Because I think if you lived past a certain age in this era, you were pretty healthy and robust and resistant to most things. Obviously, you could be killed in battle, but in general, physical elements had to be pretty serious to put you down. So much so that my understanding in Calvin's Geneva, if you failed to call the elders to your bedside within 48 hours of a sickness like this, it was a matter of church discipline. So they regarded these matters of sickness very seriously. He devotes these lyrics to falling sick, having a mini recovery, falling into a sort of a fever, and he's reflecting on it personally. And at the same time, he's reflecting on it as if he were part of the body of Christ, a person within that. So it's in the same way Dante is undergoing an individual spiritual voyage. Here we have a voyage of a man towards death. And recovery from it, and then he's reflecting on the life and significance of Christ, his death, his resurrection. All of these things are pulled in and interwoven into his poem. So, first poem we'll look at is the fifth sonnet. I am a little world made cunningly. Do you want to read that, Bill?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Pull it up here. I am a little world made cunningly of elements and an angelic sprite, but black sin hath betrayed to endless night my world's both parts, and oh, both parts must die. You, which beyond the heavens which was most high, have found new spheres and of new lands can write. Pour new seas in mine eyes, so that I might drown my world with my weeping earnestly, or wash it, if it must be drowned no more. But oh, it must be burnt. Alas, the fire of lust and envy burnt it heretofore, and made it fouler. Let their flames retire, and burn me, O Lord, with a fiery zeal of thee and thy house, which doth in eating heal.
Yeah, thank you. The poem is what I use to illustrate one of Donne's favorite motifs, which is the comparison of a microcosm to a macrocosm. And Donne is not unique in this. The comparison of an individual to a world or a republic goes as far back as the ancient Greeks, in which they regard people to be composed of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and having a spiritual element to them. That they will call this the soul. Donne is following in those footsteps. Likewise, in Plato's Republic, when he's talking about justice, he's talking about it for the individual soul, but he illustrates that by representing on the macrocosmic scale, so talking about a whole republic of individuals, etc. But really, he's talking about what justice is for the individual. Donne does that here as well, but what he interweaves with that is a Christian narrative of the of creation and of judgment and of sin and of new creation. And all of these, he also connects something that I didn't mention thus far, but we probably should have, which is the discovery of the new world. This is not new to Donne's day, but it's still an active and important subject of contemplation. What exactly are the Europeans to make of these people on the other side of the Atlantic that had never been mentioned in previous writing? They're basically unknown to the ancient world, or at least as far as they know. And so there's something about the new lands in this reference to the poem, and you can see in the period as well. What are we to make of these new peoples? How do they relate to Adam and Eve? Where did they come from, etc.? These things are there as well. So this is part of the not just the breaking of knowledge, but the addition of new knowledge. But he begins with the idea that he himself is a little world, this microcosm, and he has these 2 parts: elements, the 4 elements I spoke of, earth, air, fire, and water. By the way, in this age, they still do not know about what we call chemistry. They regard us to be the composition of various physical entities, which result in various psychological properties, which I think we mentioned in relation to Shakespeare as the humors, and an angelic part, the spiritual element of human nature. But, and here's where he differs from the ancient world, but black sin hath betrayed it to endless night. My world's both parts, both the spiritual and the physical, are compromised by sin. And he says quite orthodoxly, and both parts must die. What does that word death mean, however? Physical death is clear. What is spiritual death? Well, for Donne and his contemporaries, it's the judgment before God and the ultimate consequence of sin that he has in mind here. And so you need to see this on a physical level, a spiritual level, and even an eschatological level. Here, where are things going there? That's the opening quatrain of what will be effectively a Shakespearean sonnet.
Yeah, there's a number of things that you mentioned that I like here. This notion of the macro and micro. This was a standard way for an educated person to think and to express him or herself. And you and I spoke about this at the level of the logos back during season 1, the macro,
Yes.
the micro logos. So John Donne is simply implying a certain structure, a framework, which he assumes his educated audience already has, and has many, as you pointed out, has many other contributing thinkers and authors who have fed into this macro micro model, the personal and the world, the cosmological that is out there. So, and again, this is a framework that perhaps many modern readers of Donne don't have, so they don't actually see how he's feeding into that and subverting it, because now I have to bring in this word, which is a very modern word bandied around continuously, of subverting art and subverting worldviews and subverting cultural assumptions and things like that. Here, certainly John Donne is subverting not just the sonnet form, but as you say, the courtly love form, but he's subverting it to an unexpected end. In fact, the unexpected is kind of what John Donne specializes in.
Indeed.
And he brings in these things and, as Johnson would say, yokes together this notion of courtly love on the one hand, which is risque and in certain points blatantly anti-Christian, and then he marries it to a religious purpose, if you like, and takes it in unexpected directions. The last thing I'd like to note here is that I don't think in the English language anybody has done a better job at writing the poetry of contrition Uh, this is a major engine, in my view, driving a lot of what John Donne is trying to achieve. And we see it here, I think, in magnified form. And this is a man, as it were, looking in the mirror of death, and he does not like what he sees at the spiritual level, never mind the physical level, as you say.
Yeah, and for that reason, I think he's a thoroughly Christian author, because he's accepted the very severe of human nature, that it is utterly fallen and needs total redemption, therefore. And that is these positions which one associates with Calvinism often, although I think that they're to be found there in Roman Catholicism as well, in many of its main eddies, at any rate, and currents, is strong and Donne, and unsurprisingly so, given the violence of his discordant, heterogeneous ideas. So this idea that black sin hath betrayed to endless night both parts, and both parts must die. That's where he finishes the first quatrain, but then he moves on. And he does this in all of his, I think, his holy sonnets. There is a very decided almost pause between the quatrains and the rhyming couplets at the end. So there's a pause here, the end stop. He moves on to a new idea, and it really is a new idea, and it's related to the previous one, and yet it is introducing something previously unmentioned. You, reference to God. Remember, these are holy sonnets. They're dedicated to God. That is the intended audience of his sonnets as well. These are devotionals. Remember, he didn't publish these in his time. They were devotionals by and large, maybe circulated to his friends. But you, which beyond that heaven which was most high, have found new spheres. Now, heaven, remember, in the conceptualization of the age, lies outside the created universe. In Dante's Paradiso, heaven is not at the top of the ladder, as it were. It's outside the created order of things. And so when he says that you are beyond that heaven, which is, there's a heaven and there's a heaven of heavens, and then outside and above all that, that's where God is. And we are outside of that. And we're looking from the outside in. So the heavenly city, we're outsiders looking in on it. And therefore, Lewis in his Narnia Chronicles speaks about not only going further up, but further in, because we're going into something that we're excluded from by virtue of the fact that we're sinners. So you, which beyond that heaven which was most high, have found new spheres, and of new lands can write. New, speaking to God here, pour new seas in mine eyes. Now this is imperative. Remember, he is speaking to God. This is already, quite frankly, shocking language. He's bossing God around. He is commanding certain things. That why that so I might drown my world with my weeping earnestly, or wash it if it must be drowned no more. In both of these things, the imperative is of desperation. So the imperative must not be understood as I just put it, God being bossed around by Donne. It's more a plaintive demand. I need total redemption, so drown it. But then he realizes that in Genesis, God has said he would no more drown the earth as he did in the days of Noah. So then wash it with what? The waters of baptism.
Mhm.
So he plays on scriptural language and with strongly theological scenes or images here. Do you have anything to add to that, Bill?
Well, you see him moving here into antipodes and extremes and absolutes and hyperbole. And we have to understand, as you say, it's not him trying to boss God around. It doesn't have the sense of an imperative. I agree with you. It has a sense of a wildly desperate plea. And so the emotional register of these poems also is extremely high. They can be, if you're reading them properly, a little bit exhausting. And I think this is one of the things that generations immediately hereafter found rather distasteful about John Donne. He seemed to lack that modulation and self-control that a cultured individual would express in his writings. John Donne is not interested in doing any of this. He's very much over the top. We also have to remember that John Donne's poetry is, in some senses, correctly called metaphysical poetry. That is to say that it is designed very deliberately for deep rigorous intellectual and, as you pointed out, theological contemplation. And if you don't bring at least some, if not a lot of that erudition to your reading of John Donne, you're not going to get a lot out of that there.
No.
He's working his way through theological issues in a lot of these, as he quite rightly should, considering his final identity as Dean of St. Paul's. So this is an aspect too, which I find in a lot of universities nowadays is quietly excised out, either because the professor is not sympathetic to a lot of the things that John Donne is saying, or is simply incapable of feeding meaningfully back into them.
Yeah,
So this,
no, that's all valid points as far as I'm concerned. The thing that I noted, and I thought when I was reading it there, I said that it breaks into quatrains, but here he does something which again will land him in deep water with the classicist. He actually enjams the line from 8 to 9, and so it's not in jam, but he does not end the line in line 8. Weeping earnestly, or wash it if it must be drowned no more. Now that's the 9th line. So he's now bled the octave or into the sestet. But note how it fits around not drowning, but rather washing. And now he's setting up these antitheses, as you said. One is purpose of destruction. The other is the purpose of new birth. Still types of water, but now we have the washing as opposed to the drowning. And then he comes with the discordant thought from that. The opposite of drowning or washing is burning. Now he's going to use the different connotations of burning. Well, what are those connotations? Well, they are rich and deep, and we can see them as far back as even the pagan poets. Burning can have the idea of fire. It can have the idea of the underworld and the burning in the underworld. It can have supernatural and, quite frankly, the fires of hell connotations. And here he talks about that. But oh, it must be burnt.
yes, well, there's another association we can mention there of the theological and fire, which is this notion of the Holy Spirit and Pentecost and these sorts of things. If you look at
Exactly.
you'll oftentimes see the apostles portrayed with little flames over their head.
Tongues of fire.
What exactly is going on there? Don't kid yourself. John Donne is fully aware of all of these sorts of registers as he's writing at the theological level.
It's part of the age. If you think it's too intellectual, too far-fetched, then you're certainly wrong. That's entirely intentional. And yes, it's overly intellectualized. That's characteristic of the age as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so, but oh, it must be burnt. Alas, now, okay, it must be burnt. So what? Alas, the fire of lust and envy have burnt it heretofore. Okay, that's a type of, that's eros. That's, in fact, it's not eros, it's porneia. It's the sort of, the fire of lust as opposed to love. So that sort of burning. And that's his problem. Remember, the man is on his deathbed and he is contemplating the possibility of eternal damnation. So if the tone of the poem is of extremity, then you can understand why, given what he sees, what is at stake here. So, alas, of lust and envy have burned it heretofore and made it fouler. Let their flames retire and burn me, O Lord, with a fiery zeal of thee and thy house, which doth an eating heal. Now he's talking about the holiness of God, that fiery presence that will not tolerate sin. That's what he needs. He ends the poem to some degree on similar themes with which he began. He's dealing with the problem of sin.
Yes. He is messing around also with the different species of love. And you and I have talked about, you mentioned porneia and eros, and we've obviously got agape, love that can factor
Yep.
into, well, we had our dichotomy of cupiditas and caritas. Again, all of this is machinery in the background of John Donne's thinking here. So he wants to burn with this other love, and he doesn't have to unpack that to his audience. They know where he's going with these sorts of things. And you end with that contrary notion that within devouring this burning and what have you, it actually heals you. It does the opposite of what you would have thought, which is classic John Donne, of taking something and just flipping the whole structure against what we would have expected. Let me also say something a little bit about his style of poetry. This is something which can't be excised from consideration of his content, obviously. And many people have lamented and others have celebrated. You mentioned that he's using enjambment in there, and it's not uncommon for John Donne to use hypermetric lines. It's not uncommon for him to use substitution.
No.
Uh, so that oftentimes, when I was a young reader of John Donne, I had to scratch my head and wonder, what meter am I actually reading here? There's so much substitution.
And he
And
begins with substitution even. That's often the case. So
John Donne is one of the most dramatic poets when it comes to kicking in the door and saying, aha, here I am, here's my poem. Few people do it better than, I would argue, than Donne. And I think the only major poet in English who rivals Donne for this wild, experimental uh, building of poetry is somebody who's going to come a very short time after him, John Milton. John Milton oftentimes will play extremely fast and loose with expectations, especially at the stylistic and mechanical level.
yeah.
A thing for which he also drew some degree of criticism, but John
Yes.
even more so. And we're seeing it here play out again very, very dramatically. This is a fast moving poem, and if your attention fades for a little bit, you'll find yourself someplace completely unexpected.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. But it's interesting in an age where people are literalists, and will only understand words or even even I would say figurative connotations in one direction. They're going to find Donne endlessly fascinating or impossible, because there is no such simplicity about Donne.
no.
And yet, for somebody with Christian sensibilities, the contrast that he brings to the fore are sort of crucial to Christian religious experience.
Yes, this is we oftentimes find John Donne being read in quietly, studiously anti-intellectual environments, whether that be from a Christian perspective, because that branch does exist, or from a secular perspective as well. I remember when I was first encountering the poetry of John Donne, it was in the third year of my BA, and I was being taught John Donne, perhaps fortunately, by this great grinning tall spider of a man, Professor Stanwood. And he went to great pains to unpack the intellectual complexity of what we were looking at with John Donne, which was a great service to me. But we found, as you've already mentioned here, that there's a polarizing of readers when they read John Donne. And sadly, nowadays, a majority find him too confusing, too much work, too shocking in certain ways. They have a number of reasons for not really caring for John Donne.
Hmm.
And then you have a small subset that reads him and thinks, oh, this is fascinating.
Yeah.
Great stuff. I could read this all day. And off they would go. And that was certainly my actual experience in third year
Yeah.
BA.
Yeah.
Him.
So we had two poems. I wonder if we should go through both of them or not. I think so.
Okay. Yeah.
But we'll do it relatively. So the next one is the 10th sonnet, and it is a meditation on death, and it's a famous one. Maybe we'll do it quickly and then get on to the 14th, which is even more famous. Would you like me to read this and you read the last one, or okay.
Let's have you read this.
Okay. And it's a reflection on I think 1 Corinthians 15, where it speaks about the last enemy is death.
Mhm.
And of course, God will put death under his feet, as he did in the resurrection, but we also all will. And therefore, death, where is thy sting, is Paul's phrase. So that Donne has that in mind as he himself is now encountering death. Remember, this is still in the middle of the sequence. And he's reflecting on how impoverished death is by the resurrection of Christ and how it applies to himself then. But then he will still move back and forth. But let me read it. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkst thou dost overthrow die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow, and soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and soul's delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell, and poppy or charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke. Why swell'st thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die.
Excellent.
I think this one is less complex than any of the others, and so therefore we can probably skirt over it a little bit more quickly. But it's as I say. It is the whole sequence is related to death and sin and sickness as a symptom of sin. By the way, if there's no sin in the world, sickness does not exist, let alone death. But the fear is of death, the great enemy. But here at this point, he's almost triumphant in his attitude towards death. And we'll see it's not the end of the sonnet sequence, having said that, which is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And if we were going to Disneyfy Donne's holy sonnets, we might end with this, vaunting at death and saying there is no fear for me of death, because he's feeling better at this point, perhaps, and he's conquered. Um, but the idea of death as a something that has lost its power is wholly a theological point, because physically Mr.
Yeah, if you
Donne
look at
will
these
die.
lines and start taking them apart as well, you can see
Go ahead.
sorry.
No, go
Yeah,
ahead.
if you look at the actual lines, you can see throughout here that he's also oscillating. It's like he's inserting voltas with a shotgun.
Yes.
Um,
I
I think
like that.
yeah, boom, Volta 1. Though some have called thee mighty and dreadful. Notice the enjambment on the end of that as well. He's done it again, sucking us into the poem, because of course the human mind likes a completed thought, and we have to go to line 2 to complete it. So we're pulled in there. And then he voltas again, for thou art not so. Okay, fine. And then he begins to expand upon that. And there's another volta. For those who thou thinkest thou dost overthrow, die not. There's another flip. Poor death. Okay, now he's actually not holding death in contempt. It's almost like he's got pity for death. This is a very strange notion. You've come to kill me, death, but I feel bad for you. And then he just keeps unpacking it. There's just, like I said, if you have motion sickness, you might want to read your Donne slowly, because you oscillate pretty darn quickly.
There's a lot of turning.
Yes.
There's no doubt about it. Turns of phrase and turns of sensibility, and they come with such dizzying rapidity that you are often disoriented. There's no doubt about it. And so I think it's not something that one reading of the poem will satisfy. You really do have to return to it and think about it and unpack it, to use the language, to get into what he is talking about. But he moves on with the idea that death cannot kill him. Well, why can't he kill him? Because he's already dead in Christ. He believes in the risen Jesus. Therefore, death means nothing to him. That's how he begins the quatrain. Then he moves on to further substantiate this. He rests, he sleeps. When you rest or sleep, you look like you're dead. And we feel better after a rest or a sleep. And those are just pale imitations of what death will be. So how much better are we going to feel when we rise from the dead, right? So it's a
Death,
spurious form of argumentation.
yeah, death is a gateway to a better place.
Yeah.
Not something to be dreaded at all. And this is an idea which has been, in some senses and in some eras, worn out and turned into an almost trite cliche to note that the Christian believer should not fear death. But here Donne jumps on it, and he does what those poets at the beginning of the 20th century call making it new. Or to use even more modern jargon, quite frankly, he defamiliarizes his
Yeah,
reader.
absolutely.
Notion which has been worn out by overuse and become trite and cliched and what have you. Stop, read this sonnet, and you will see this whole concept from a very different angle. So I think that's one of the great values of John Donne. John Donne defamiliarizes in a way that's actually useful.
Yeah. And he does so. Obviously, there is a novelty to the way in which he does this. And yet at the same time, every sentiment that he expresses here is familiar to a Christian, because and it speaks to how much the defamiliarization, to use your phrase there, of the way in which the world looks at life and death is, and how different that is from the way a Christian looks at life and death. So he says, and soonest our best men with thee do go. Well, who are the soonest? Who are these best men? Well, they're the martyrs who die an untimely death, and they're themselves signposts of the resurrected life that they will gladly embrace, and it's rest of their bones and souls delivery. So again, these are further ways of maligning death and his power. Then he moves on to the third quatrain. If you have no power over me, let me talk about your company, your slave, to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. And us with poison, war, and sickness dwell. And pop, your charms can make us sleep as well, and better than thy stroke, why swellst thou then? So all of this is braggadocio. It's just
Yeah.
sort of boasting, vaunting, flighting. He's flighting death,
Yeah,
isn't
well,
he?
yeah, he is, absolutely. And he's another thing we haven't really talked about here. We talked about the violent turns into shocking new developments from prior ideas, and oftentimes within a single line. So there's a lot of velocity to that. But also what we need to keep in view here is that John Donne is also, he builds and develops and amplifies on prior ideas. So he has that little tiny phrase higher up where he says, poor death. And then, of course, we get to this treatment here, and he actually unpacks and amplifies exactly what does he mean, poor death. And
Yeah.
he's with a sense of pity and ends with a sense of contempt. A very interesting sort of emotional arc that goes on in there as well. And we also want to remember here that you mentioned martyrs and those who have gone early to God through death, as it were. And this, again, invokes this whole notion with which perhaps John Donne would be more familiar than many of his contemporaries, of this dichotomy between the martyrs on the one hand. You remember back in season 1, we were talking about this. The martyrs on the one hand, who were martyred, and this was a good thing because not only were they powerful witnesses, that is what the word martyr means, to the faith and to God's influence in the world, but they also got very quickly to be in the presence of he who they most desired, who they loved most. And then you have this other species, the confessor. And the confessor lives that long, hard life as a witness to Christ and Christ's influence in the world and things of that nature. And many of these in the saintly narratives were pining desperately to go, to die, to be with God, but they were told that under obedience to God's will, no, you cannot come to God yet. You have to stay here in the realm of death, the world. You live in the grave. They would oftentimes talk about the world as the grave, and you're living in a grave, and you are supposed to live in the grave as one of your acts of love and obedience towards God. So Donne is picking up again on a whole framework that a lot of perhaps more modern readers wouldn't have, even especially in England, when, of course, they are increasingly Anglican and Catholicism and all of its worldviews quietly fade away. We're moving into that era now. So
Mhm.
even in the 18th century, a lot of people would not necessarily have seen this tension, this dichotomy.
Yep. Yep. So I think we've probably dealt with, I mean, we could talk further length about this, but let's conclude with the 14th sonnet,
Yes.
um, which I think is the most famous of them all, and but is also complex, I think, and rich. And do you want to read it for us, Bill?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Batter my heart, three-personed God, for you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand, o'erthrow me and bend, your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. I, like a usurped town, to another do labor to admit you, but oh, to no end. Reason your viceroy in me should defend, but is captive and proves weak or untrue. But dearly I love you, and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that last line shocks a lot of my students. They don't know what to do with the fact that the poet is calling upon God to ravish him.
Mm,
And this is classic John Donne once again, bringing two sensibilities, seemingly radically antithetical sensibilities, together in a single line of poetry.
mm. I note the roots of uh, ravish and rape, but also rapture. And I do think that that is in his mind as well. There's a connection between rapture, the forcible drawing of God, and what he's talking about here, but he cannot get away from the physical connotations of it, which are throughout the entire poem. It is very violent in its imagery.
Mhm.
And it begins so, as you say, he kicks the door down. No poem of Donne's does he kick the door down quite so strongly as here. He kicks it down and picks it up and kicks it down again. There's a lot of thumping going on here. The very first word, batter, is extraordinary. And again, in general, English meter works through iambs. This poem is full of not just enjambment and caesura and the voltas that you noted everywhere, but also the knock, breathe, shine, uh, break, blow, burn, these sorts of things. These are ascendetic, tricolon, and so forth. The meter is violent, forcible breaking of the metrical regularity, and the subject matter likewise throughout the entire poem. Remember, in 10, he was vaunting over death. Now he is suggesting that he is captive to sin and he can't do anything about it. So this is a rather significant departure from where we left off. He thought he was free and clear. He has found himself that he has somehow sinned against God, and he realizes that he cannot extricate himself from his own tendency to do so. And the explanation is because he is not his own. He is captive. He is the prisoner of the enemy. The enemy, if he sees the soul as a bride and God as the husband, and yet he's a sinner, then he is in fact forcibly married to another party. He's picking up on the theme of Hosea here to some degree, the law unlawfully joined spouse. So he has in mind, as I say, Hosea chapters 1 to 3. He's also probably got the allegory of unfaithful Jerusalem in Ezekiel 16 in mind as well, where we get a sort of an allegory presentation of Israel as once being a baby, and then and God brought the child up, devoted it, showered it with care, and yet she played the whore and went after other nations' gods, and those sorts of theological meditation expressed in sexual relations and covenantal relations. And Donne is using that throughout here. The other text that bears on this is Revelation 21, where God, the new heavens and the new earth are created, and the bride, the heavenly Jerusalem, comes down from God dressed as it's a city. The heavenly Jerusalem comes down dressed as a bride. All of these are in Donne's mind here. And so he's reflecting, again, it sounds like purely relational sexual imagery, but it's really theological in its um, uh, ambit here.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting things I find in here. One of them, coming from, again, the Catholic perspective, is probably that Donne would have been more mindful of more traditional theological approaches to topics like this. So we mentioned here the city as a bride, and of course we have, by way of analogy, the church as a bride and stuff like this as well. But Donne would have been well educated in the dynamics of typology, which again we have discussed in season 1, which is that a story is an echo of a story is an echo of a story, and sometimes that's interscriptural, and at other times there's a link between scripture and extraneous texts, and maybe even historical reality and all these sorts of things. So again, there is some very, very traditional machinery here that Donne is working off of, and adds a degree of eloquence to his treatment. But the other thing is, as you say, there is this notion that he is helpless before his depravity, before his unfaithfulness to the world, and is going to take God's violence to get him out of the situation in which he has landed himself. And so you've mentioned sort of Calvinist leanings,
Yep.
and sort of a backdrop to a lot of what he's doing. And I think this is again a classic sort of a poem where you're in a position with students to talk about the increasingly important subject of total depravity and things of this nature. And oftentimes in classes, this is the point when, as soon as I introduce the idea within the context of the poem, my class explodes into debate back and forth, which I actually, as long as it stays civil and professional, I actually encourage.
No,
Where
it's great. Sure.
so this is another great debate poem. And I was mentioning this about his sermons earlier on, but if you look at his actual poetry as well, whether these are things like the Holy Sonnets or other more quote unquote secular poems, a lot of them feel almost as if they could be easy springboards into a very vivacious, a very active debate between parties of different perspectives. And indeed, maybe not just two parties, but many different parties, considering all the voltas that we encounter in Donne's poetry. And so this one is no different than that. You also were right to mention that this again is a tour de force of Donne's violent, choppy poetry. But like Eliot's poetry later on in the 20th century, we mustn't think that because the poetry is doing such radical, seemingly disjunctive things. Again, you notice we started that first line and jammed into the second line. You mentioned quite rightly that the scansion of the first line is all over the shop. My goodness. I don't know what happened there.
I say to my students, if you want to understand meter with Donne, you have to you have to begin in line 2 you can't start in the first line because it will tell you nothing.
Yes, and this is deliberate by Donne. A lot of people say, well, he just wanted to get to the subject matter. No, the violence that he's getting at is at numerous levels. You mentioned the hard first word that you encounter there, batter. Starts off with that hard B, and you move into the T's and the dentals and all these sorts of things. So the use of consonants in here and very strategic consonants is important. The meter does the same thing. It works hand in glove with that consonants that you encounter in the first line. Is really violent. The door hasn't just been kicked in, it's been shattered by the boot, and the flinders are flying everywhere. But then he falls into, there is an order to Donne. There's
Oh,
nothing.
yes.
So you mentioned the tripartite crescendos that he's building in there. Boom, boom, boom. And then, as if that weren't enough, we get the second one. And the second one actually builds off of the first one because it then uses alliteration to do work there as well. So as with Eliot's poetry, there's a lot of artistic stuff being done in amidst the seeming chaos. And it takes a trained eye to spot it. But trust me, there's a lot of craftsmanship going on in here.
Yeah, and in the assertion of and the obvious presence of discord in the poems, what is really being asserted is order in the midst of all that. And so it's in some ways like a Shakespearean tragedy in which there is terrific violence, and it's shocking to modern audiences how violent some of Shakespeare's plays can be. And yet at the end of his plays, it is almost without exception the case that the malefactors are dead and that order has been reasserted. And the same with Donne. He's not shying away from the discord in the world, from the problem of sin, from the problem of evil, from the way in which death, punctuates even the most vital human life, ends it, destroys it. And yet at the same time, he is going to strongly assert order. He does not dispense with order. He holds on to it, and yet he reflects the reality of the broken world in which he's living, which is why I find him such a vital and effective poet, because he does hold on to that tension. And the classical era, quite frankly, is a little bit too tied down. Or at least the neoclassical presentation of it. It's all a little too smooth and a little too rational and a little bit too polished for my liking.
Yeah, this is something I noted long ago about this kind of poetry here, that the chaos is only chaos when cast against a known and discernible order. And we see this at the level of course, sin and its chaos, the chaos that it causes here. Sin is sin in relation to something else, which is prior to it, which is goodness. So you have to understand one in light of the other. And in fact, Donne does this all over the place. And as you say, he grapples with unpleasant facts of the human condition. He grapples with his own fallenness. He grapples with the imminence of death. He grapples with things that many of us flinch away from when it comes to contemplation. Notice the sharp distinction between Donne's approach to this unpleasant aspect of being human compared to the Cavalier poets,
Oh,
whom retreated into artificiality and harmony and grace and peace and fantasy, the realm of the pastoral.
hmm.
We're not going to talk about it today, but Donne himself also treats the pastoral, but he does some radical things with it there. That's a podcast we're probably never going to make, but there's a big discussion waiting to happen there, because again, he's subverting things now, but not necessarily in ways that we would expect from the holy sonnets. He does other things with the pastoral, and it's emphatically not a flight from reality and the human condition and human fallenness.
Hmm. Absolutely. But to further emphasize your point about Donne's um, commitment to the doctrine of total depravity, he even speaks of reason as weak or untrue or captive. This is decidedly going against the view that we would have seen in Dante, where Virgil, the voice of reason, is able to lead him up to the top of Mount Purgatory, and then faith takes over. Donne sides here with the reformers in thinking that even reason can be perverted in its understandings of things, except for being revitalized by grace. So it's not reason that will, the pagan notion of reason, yes, right reason for sure, as Milton calls it, but reason unaided cannot ascend to the height where faith will take over. So even reason is weak, untrue, or captive. And so this great theme of being under not only under siege, but under the occupation of an enemy, so that Satan, the prince of this world, is ruling over him personally, but also over the body of Christ. So you can see this if you're taking the imagery of individual, the bride, and the corporate image, the city. When he's speaking about himself, he is speaking about the whole of humanity and those of believers. We're all betrothed unto the enemy. So then he cries out once again with this tripartite: divorce me, untie, or break that knot again. And then it moves relentlessly onward. Take me to you, imprison me, for I accept you enthrall me, never shall be free. Their paradox. Nor ever chaste, except you ravish me. These are, I don't even know how to express them. They never cease to violate my sensibilities of rectitude and so forth. And yet they fit entirely with the entire focus of the poem, and furthermore tie in with scriptural themes. I don't think God is ever presented as a ravisher. On the other hand, there is a reference to the rapture.
Mm-hmm.
It's a violent, forcible incursion of God into the world to end and to conclude the travails of his church. And he seems to be echoing that here.
Yeah, we have to remember the Latin word rapira here. Rapira translates roughly as to take, or sometimes it's translated as to snatch.
Yep.
And of course, it becomes the root of our modern word rape. Of course, this is its most sensational survival, but it has other senses here as well, which are theological and biblical, as you say. Also, this notion that reason alone is insufficient is another idea that is going to, ties into profound speculations upon the limits of reason by the great skeptics and people like this. You mentioned Descartes earlier on, and people like this, but it also would stick in the craw of later thinkers, the rationalists, the positivists that we're about to encounter. Of course, they're
Yeah.
going to somebody saying something like this, but and the last thing I'd like to point out about his treatment of reason here and its limitations is that he actually demonstrates what he's talking about with those last two lines. He gives you notions which seem antithetical and mutually contradictory, and yet there they are as realities. Can your reason encompass how that works? No, but does it seem like it might be true? Yes. So wait, but my reason didn't take me there, so how did I get there?
Yeah. To be clear, Donne is not critiquing reason as a romantic would in
No, no.
saying that reason is invalid. It doesn't work. He's saying that unless it has faith, it doesn't operate rightly. And this is Milton's phrase, which is current in the period, is of right reasoning. And faith informing understanding.
Again, we have to move back to earlier Catholic thinkers on this front as well, which Donne is likely to have read. I'm thinking here. Oh, I had his name. I was going to say Occam, but it's not Occam.
Anselm?
It might be, yeah. I do not reason so that I might have faith. I have faith, and therefore I am able to reason.
Oh, okay.
Who is that again? I should know this off the top of my head, but I can't recall. But this is an idea that gets thrown around everywhere in the Middle Ages. This is a starting point of many conversations. And it's a point that would have been point blank obvious to John Donne. Yes, you do not reason your way to faith. You have faith, and this actually facilitates reason. And of course, that's taken apart there because all reason starts from predicates which are taken on faith and so on and so forth. And so
I'm no Roman Catholic, but I've often questioned whether Dante rightly represents the Catholic position on reason and faith. I think that he does not myself, but
yeah, well, we have to remember here, and this is another thing, which is that Donne represents the tail end of a highly speculative and therefore intellectual era. These are people who explore. These are people who experiment. These are people who go places and try things in sort of an excited way, which other eras would not do. And of course, this is one of the hallmarks of intellectual endeavor. An intellectual is continuously asking why, and what if. This is the realm of Augustine. We've seen this before. And we're about to move into an age of, on the other hand, primarily dominated by a lot of philology, which has a large, complex set of rigorously correct knowledge. What are you doing with the rigorously correct knowledge? I don't know. It just, I set it up there and there it is. Well, yeah, but it's not doing anything for you.
and that philology was spurred in the 16th century by the discovery of the New World to some degree.
Yes, it was. It was, absolutely.
Yeah. Bill, I think we've talked around this pretty significantly. At any rate, we could talk a great deal about it. But do you have anything more to add on this? I'm
not on this front per se. As I said, all these discussions that you and I have are meant in the classical sense of satira. They are strands, introductory strands for our listeners to pick up and follow under their own powers, where they might find it interesting, where they might find it useful and stuff like this. We make no claims whatsoever to be comprehensive or exhaustive in our discussions, not at all. So it's a sampler plate, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have talked about this off air, and we'll talk about more of this in episodes, but our hope down the road is to offer courses online where we might be able to, engage with an audience a bit more, and to dig down more deeply and in some of the areas that we've only touched upon, and in other areas where we've just totally bypassed. But yeah.
Yeah, the list of authors, great authors, interesting, fascinating authors, and their beautiful works, their powerful and moving works. That list is well nigh endless, what you and I have passed over.
Yep.
And these are things which maybe in later times we might come back to and address and share to greater effect with our audiences to contribute and give something to them. But for now, let me just end by saying that next podcast, we are considering talking about the poet George Herbert, contemporary of John Donne's, and also an extremely, extremely interesting metaphysical poet, but very unique in certain ways from John Donne and what John Donne is doing both stylistically and in terms of content. So I'm very much looking forward to that conversation.
Me too. So I'm Scott Masson with Paideia today with Dr. Bill Friesen. We shall see you next time. Look forward to it. See you then.
Take care.